Talk and Rock Radio, where friends meet at the intersection of life, inspiration, and music. Here's your host, Rick Kern.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk and Rock Radio. Recently, a friend of mine, Bernie Sargent, attended a talk that was given on Buddy Holly. After the talk, he told the presenter that there was a guy that he needs to talk about his rock and roll knowledge. On today's episode, I'm bringing to you that guy, a professor that teaches courses on the history of rock and roll. Welcome, Steve Davis. How you doing, Steve?
It's great to be here this afternoon. Been really looking forward to this.
Glad to have you with us, man. Tell me a little bit about the school that you're teaching at, and I know there's several branches of it and everything. Why don't you tell everybody exactly where you're at and how big the campuses are and everything?
Well, I'm at Lone Star College, and it's a really big. I think it's the biggest in Texas in regard to the total enrollment. I lose count. I think we have 7 or 8 colleges now. We've recently had one come on that's entirely online. So as I said, it's hard for me to keep track because it's grown really very dramatically over the years. But Lone Star College is located up to the north of Houston, generally in Harris County and into Montgomery County, where we have a very large suburban population. And I'm at the branch in Kingwood. Kingwood's a suburban kind of equivalent to Plano in Dallas, I think would be a good analogy. And we have, I think, now about 10,000 students enrolled at our college alone, and overall it's over 90,000. So it's a big community college district. And of course, we get the whole range of students. We get those fresh out of high school who are transferring to college eventually. We get people who are returning to school. I'm getting a lot of veterans in class, for instance, people who've deferred their educations, people who want to get some kind of technical training. So I really love it because we get the whole range, and it makes it very exciting.
I got to tell you, Steve, I would have loved back in the 60s when I was going to college, taking a course on rock and roll history instead of taking parasitology, zoology, biology, all of those things that we take as students in colleges those days. But anyway, I want you to share a little bit about how all of this comes about. The value of rock and roll in the history of rock and roll in your curriculum.
Well, I think, I had known for some time before I started doing it more than 20 years ago that at various colleges and universities around, there were rock and roll history classes. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that myself. I need to prepare myself to do so. But in terms of making the case for it, what could be more important in our lives than music? And anything that we spend that kind of time and we put that kind of emotion into is a serious subject that's worthy of study. And I think certainly rock and roll, I mean, music generally, but rock and roll, really is the music that so many of us love. It's a popular music. Classical music, it has its adherents, but that's a different kind of animal. And so I think on the one hand, it's worthy of study. It's a serious subject. I think also it's a perfect tool to teach critical thinking. Now, we talk about that all the time, the value of critical thinking, to be able to think independently, to think for yourself. But how do we actually do that? And what better instrument could there be than music that we care so much about in the first place? To learn how to express how you feel about a song or a band, why you like it, why you don't like it, to be able to articulate that and to make your case. And the important thing is, it's very subjective. It's art, and not everybody's going to agree. And it's very important to learn how to have those kinds of discussions. So I think there are serious things to be accomplished, critical thinking, and just the content is important, but also it's fun. And, why shouldn't school be fun? I've had
Exactly.
people tell me that all the time, Rick. Man, I wish, just like you sort of expressed, I wish there'd been something like that when I was in school. And so I think it really fulfills a lot of those objectives, and it's a lot of fun for me to teach. And I have to say too, it's a way that I keep young because my mindset. It's important to do something that is invigorating, and it gives me a connection to the kids. I say the kids because I mean the typical student of mine, most of whom are just out of high school, we're a couple of generations apart now, but it keeps me in touch. And so it has all kinds of good purposes it fulfills.
You know, when we talk about rock and roll history, there are many bands and names that we could talk about, and we could do that for hours.
Mhm.
What I'd like to do today is let's just touch right on it. Let's talk about the outbreak of Beatlemania in the early, 60s, 64 to be exact,
Yes.
and the importance of the historical timing of that, if you'd elaborate
Yes.
on that.
Well, it's been something on our minds because we had that anniversary of the night that the Beatles appeared on the Sullivan Show. This was their introduction to this country for almost all of us. That was on the night of February 9 of 1964. And I'm sure you were watching. I believe you told me that you were, and I was, and over 70 million people were tuned in. And it really changed our lives. And so the Beatles made a huge impression. The music, of course, had to be good for that to take place, but in many ways, the timing was just right. And one thing I think that made this the truth was the Kennedy assassination. And we're of that generation, Rick, that can remember exactly time and place. And for Texans especially, because it happened in our state, it really hit home, literally hit home. And so the country was still, to some degree, some months later, especially young people, because President Kennedy was the youngest president ever at the time of his election. For youth, it was especially traumatizing. And we were still in something of a funk in the aftermath of that. And so to have some new kind of music, really it was American rock and roll that was just kind of revitalized by this British band, was very important to lift everyone's spirits at that time. So you think about a song like I Want to Hold Your Hand, which was the first American release on Capitol Records and went right to the top of the charts. It's just a song that's so much fun. It's so joyous. Every time I'm at a show with a Beatles tribute band and you hear those opening notes of I Want to Hold Your Hand, people right away rush to the dance floor, or you do the clap alongs, right? The syncopated hand claps that go
Yeah.
with it. And so the timing was just perfect in that way. I think another thing was it has to do with demographics. And you and I both represent the baby boom generation. This is where the history comes in, when I'm teaching the class as an historian, I can bring in the stuff that is more traditional history. The baby boom starts in 1946. So if you think about that first edge of the baby boom, those who were born between 1946 and 1954, at the time the Beatles come here, they're between 10 and 18 years old. And so that's the demographic this music is aiming at. And we've got a bulge in the population we've never had before or since the percentage of teenagers be as high as it was at that time. So the timing was just right in that respect in terms of the potential market for this kind of music. Think about I Want to Hold Your Hand, how important that is when you're in the 8th grade and you're hanging out with a girl that you really like, and holding hands, that's a real breakthrough. That's something that, is a real sign of you're growing up. It's something that's very, very thrilling. And the last thing I would say is, and this is a point that I think can be overstated, but I'll make it all the same. There was a feeling that something had happened to rock and roll right at the end of the 1950s. Um, we had some tragedies occur. There was the terrible plane crash that killed Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Richie Valens. Jerry Lee Lewis messed up and married a cousin who was underage. Little Richard was always deeply religious, but decided rock and roll was devil's music, and he retired and went to Bible college. Elvis went in the army for 2 years. He served, came back. When he came back, he was a different kind of singer. Chuck Berry got busted on a morals charge. So some have made the case that that founding generation of rock and roll, some of them either no longer were with us or their careers had kind of gotten derailed. And so the music had kind of not exactly progressed. And we needed something new and something really better at that time. Now, a reason I think we don't want to overstate this is there was some really good music before the Beatles came in the early 1960s. We had the Four Seasons, and we had Roy Orbison, and the Beach Boys already had hits by that time. We had the girl groups. We had Motown was up and running. So that point can be overstated. But I think that was a factor too, that the rock and roll scene was looking for something new, and the Beatles certainly supplied that.
Why would you say that the music of the Beatles 60 years, after they first came to this country, why does that music still matter?
Mhm. Well, I think because for one thing, it stood, the definition of classic is has it stood the test of time? And it
Yeah.
has. And it's because the music's really, really good. Now we can look back and see, sadly, some of the music that we liked at that time doesn't hold up nearly as well. And I don't want to put this band down, but I'll give a good example, and that would be the Dave Clark Five. And the Dave Clark Five had some great hits, and they were second only to the Beatles in the number of records sold in this country in 1964. But we don't really think of them that much today because the music just doesn't hold up as well. And the band didn't progress the way the Beatles did. The Beatles were in a continual state of evolution, and the Dave Clark Five, more or less to some degree, stayed pat. So I think that's a kind of an example there. That's why the Beatles still, all this time later, the music's still good. Now we had a notable Beatles author, Ken Womack, came to our campus and spoke in April, and I think I asked the question, or somebody did, how long are people going to listen to the Beatles? How long is this going to last? It's lasted this long, and he made a kind of audacious assertion. He said, as long as there's music, people are going to listen to this, because some of that stuff that John and Paul wrote, especially, and some of George's compositions too, are going to be with us. I think for really for for maybe for centuries. Just as there are composers now who wrote hundreds of years ago that are still in the catalog today. So there's something about just the quality of the music.
They did over 13 albums, and I was going to ask you, is of those 13, are there any favorites of yours that you really care for that, more than the others?
It's really funny because it changes over time, and I think
Yeah.
that's okay that we change our minds about things, that just our lives evolve, where we're coming from personally, and we look at and listen to things from a different perspective, and that accounts for some of it. So, for a long time, I said it was Rubber Soul, and now I'm more inclined to say Revolver. But, Abbey Road, I never used to like Abbey Road as much as I do now, and you'll hear a lot of people tell you that Abbey Road, it gets a lot of votes for favorite Beatles album. There was some recent Apple list of the greatest albums of all time, and I think Abbey Road was the one that was up there, way up there in the top 10. I
It
hear a lot of
was.
people make the case for the White Album. I've never been that sold on that because I think, frankly, the White Album has a lot of junk on it. But
One of,
some people just love that.
one of
And
my favorites was Rubber Soul because I really love Norwegian Wood. You want to talk
yeah,
about that one a little bit? Norwegian
well,
Wood?
yeah, we could do that. That song has my favorite Beatles line of all time. It's written by John, and it starts with the line, "I once had a girl, or should I say, she once had me." And that's great because it's still about relationships. It's about boys and girls, but it's not on the level of "I want to hold your hand." Things have become more complex by the time that they record that in 1965. And what's stunning is that's only a 2 or 3 years after their recording career had started, because they'd started recording, "Love Me Do," I think is 1962. So they grew in a remarkably short period of time. It's about a one night stand.
Hmm.
The story behind it, something real life that John, and it's, what it's talking about is there's a sexual revolution occurring in the 1960s, and the Beatles personally they're inspiring some of that with the music, and rock and roll is about sex to some degree, right? In terms of
Hmm.
where it originally is, what even the term can mean on one level. So there's a sexual revolution, and the Beatles are inspiring it, but they're also participating in it. So I think the song touches on that. And it's one of those great songs to discuss in class. It only lasts 2 minutes. It's great poetry. You put the lyrics up on the screen, and let's try to figure out what happened. He's with this girl in her flat, and he's drinking her wine and biding his time. And then things are getting hopeful because he says something like, "And then she said it's time for bed." And the question is, did anything really happen? And if you look at the lyrics really closely, it doesn't seem like it, because he went off and he slept in the bath. And he got up the next day, and the girl had disappeared. "This bird has flown," as he said. The girl wasn't there anymore. And so I lit a fire, isn't it good Norwegian wood? So, you can have a good discussion. What is this all about? What do the lyrics even mean? Because there are various ways it can be interpreted. And that's what I love to do about that, because it's one of those cases where, we can look back and some of the Beatles talk about later maybe what they were getting at, but it's up to us ultimately to come up with an interpretation and give it meaning. And that's going to vary. And we can have some good discussions about where we're coming down on that. So I think the song is good in content and the story it's telling. Also, it's not too long after they had met Bob Dylan, and you see some of the influence, and the song starts with acoustic guitar. So some of Dylan's folk influence is coming in, and right away too, you hear a sitar being played, and
Hmm.
that's George Harrison's fascination with Indian music. And George plays a major role in introducing the Western world to some sounds coming from the East. So I think there's a whole lot of stuff in that song to be unpacked. And it's amazing again that we've got a piece of recording here that's about 2 minutes long, and yet we can really dig deep and dig a fair amount of content out of it.
Do you have a favorite Beatle, Steve?
Well, again, that's changed over time, and, after I tell you mine, I wanna hear, how you feel about that, but if mine is Paul, but for many years, I scoffed at that idea. I remember when Bill Clinton was running for president in 1992, and he was on, MTV, and somebody asked him for his favorite Beatle, and he said Paul, and I said, "Oh, what a wuss." I thought that was just such a squirrely answer, but now, I've come to feel I used to answer John, but I have so much respect for Paul. Of course, it's so tragic that John isn't with us anymore, but Paul has been there and he's remained competitive. He likes to say, don't just play the oldies, but continually try to write new music and to be relevant in the musical sphere. And I appreciate that. But I also, looking back at the Beatles, I know now more than I did back then about how hard Paul worked to try to keep the band together when it was falling apart. And
Right.
ultimately, it was John, and Yoko plays an obvious role there, but it was John who, in September of 1969, after they finished Abbey Road, Paul said, and here's Paul, he said, we had such a great experience. We made such great music in the studio. Let's go back on the road. Let's play some clubs. Let's just make it unannounced and show up in a town and play a club gig. Wouldn't that be fun? Because he's so fired up about the band, doing what they've been doing for these years. And John at that point says, "You're daft. You're crazy. I want a divorce." And that was the end of it right there. And so I just have so much respect for Paul and how hard he tried to keep it together. And I think he deserves so much credit for that. Now, having said that, how about you? Who's your favorite Beatle?
To me, it's kind of like you. It's changed through the years. I love the writing of all the Beatles. It's been incredible. But I think ultimately, now that I've had time to really listen to all their music and understand it, I'm going to have to say Ringo. Ringo, every time I would watch Ringo, it was always, he was so animated, and of course, being a drummer and coming up playing drums at an early age, it gave me a lot more appreciation when I'm watching this guy play. It seemed like everything was so fluid and easy for him. It was very relaxed and very what I want to call simplified. It looked
Hmm.
very simple. He was a minimalist when he played. And I'm going to quote the great Miles Davis. Miles Davis, one of the best, you know, trumpet players that ever lived. He once said, "It's not the notes that you play; it's the notes that you don't play."
Yes.
And I think that's a lot. That kind of describes Ringo. He was a he was a the perfect drummer for the Beatles. He played to the music. He
Hmm.
played what he needed to play. And a really unique thing about him is that he is a left-handed drummer playing
Hmm.
a right-handed drum kit.
Hmm.
He would keep his tempos and his accents on the hi-hat, and then he would always lead off with his fills, starting with his left hand. And
Yes.
a very unique drummer. And to this day, I just really love what he does. He's got great musicians behind him. And that goes without saying. So does Paul. He's still doing the shows. I mean, they've been
Mhm.
doing it for a long time, and they're still getting after it. I love the shows that they do. I love the music. The musicians that are behind them are phenomenal now. I got to tell you one more thing about Ringo. There's a real good friend of mine by the name of Don Clow, and he used to front one of the best vocal show bands that I've ever seen in this country. My group performed with them when we were up in Canada, and they were called Command Performance. And I still to this day stay in touch with Don. I mean, we go back 45 years,
Mhm.
and we still stay in touch. He lives in Las Vegas with his wife, and the other day I was talking to him about doing this show with you, and that we were going to do a large concentration on the Beatles. And he
Mhm.
said, when we were playing, meaning his group, when we were playing at the Edgewater in Seattle, he said the Beatles were staying there, and we got invited to go to a party that night to be with them. And so we went, and he said, out of all the Beatles, he said, my favorite was Ringo because he was very kind. He was the nicest and the most outgoing of all four of them.
Mhm.
So that's kind of cool. I really I was talking to my last lead guitar player with the group I had on the road, and he currently works the showroom at Harrah's in San Diego, and he has had Ringo and the All Star Band play there. In fact, I think they played there last year, and
Mhm.
he said, "Yeah, Ringo is a very complicated guy, but very very nice, and he's not a real touchy feely kind of guy,
Mhm.
but." When Dan had the opportunity to really get to know, Ringo and everything, and he was taking him around on, I guess, the golf cart around the property and showing him, what was going on there and everything, and seeing the property and what all they had going, and he said, um, at the very end, after the show was done and everything, Ringo actually came up to Danny and gave him a big hug. So
Mhm.
that was kind of cool. Just
Yeah,
here's a guy that's
absolutely.
not very touchy feely, but they really hit it off and really made things happen. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's my feeling about who my favorite is.
And we can't quarrel with a choice like that, and you make a powerful case. And when I hear you speak about that, I wish I could magically transport you to class. And who knows, maybe we could do it via Zoom someday and have your drum kit set up and demonstrate some of
Uh,
the things. Because when we learn about or when we read about Ringo's drum fills and how brilliant they were, then it's harder for me to articulate that to the students. I can hear it. I think I know what people are talking about. But for a drummer, of course, this is exactly where you come from. I'm thinking about in "Please Please Me," the chords that end the song, and before each chord is struck, and right after it, Ringo does a roll. I mean, it's just and it's just, man, the song ends on it doesn't fade, it just ends, and again, the song comes in at about 2 minutes, and oh my god, it's a perfect piece of rock and roll.
hey
And I was
Steve,
thinking, uh-huh.
didn't you go to UT Austin?
No, mm-mm.
Oh,
I
okay.
was I was at U of H,
Oh,
almost
okay.
my entire
All
career.
right.
Yes.
I
Uh-huh.
was
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
some reason I was thinking you went there, but well, they
Uh-huh.
have a really cool museum there called the Ransom Museum.
Mhm.
In
Yeah,
the
Harry
Ransom
Ransom, yes.
Museum, they've got some
Mhm.
really neat stuff there. They got
Mhm.
Gutenberg Bible. They've got all kinds of really neat things. But they when we went there, they had a Beatles exhibit, and
Mhm.
they actually had, a Ludwig set just like Ringo's, same color, everything. And what was cool about it is they had a computer hooked up to it, and you could engage with a drum lesson with Ringo. You get there
Yeah.
and you put on the headset and
Yeah.
sit behind the kit
Uh-huh.
and play along with Ringo, and he would tell you
Yeah.
what to do and everything. So uh, we
Yeah.
when we were there visiting, my daughter and I both did that. We both had our moment
Yes.
playing with
Yes.
Ringo. It was kind of fun. So
It was a Ludwig Black Pearl, if I'm not mistaken, and the
that's what
Beatles
it
are really
is.
well
Yeah.
that Beatles equipment becomes a subject of interest and importance for a lot of people. And I see right behind you, of course, is the classic logo with the drop T that,
Yeah.
immediately
It's
there it is right there. And I think you made a good point too, just about Ringo's personality. I think about that specific example when I play in class the clip of the Beatles on the Sullivan Show the next year in 1965. Ringo would typically sing one song per album. In this case, he's performing there on the Sullivan Show, Act Naturally, which is they're covering a Buck Owens song. And there's just, when the camera's on him and he's singing, and of course, you've told me that you're a singing drummer too, so you can appreciate somebody who can drum and sing, even though Ringo's not the world's greatest singer. He's more than capable. But there's just such a feeling of joyousness on his face that he's there. And part of it is, man, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. Here I was playing with this band, Liverpool, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and the Beatles sacked their drummer, Pete Best, and I got called on to replace him. And, I became the missing piece. And look at where I am now. And it's just so, just intoxicating to see Ringo and just how happy he is to be doing what he's doing.
And he's got great musicians behind him. There's a guy that I've done a show with. His name is Warren Ham. And Warren plays percussion with Ringo. He plays saxophone. He plays keyboards. He sings incredibly well. And I can't say enough about the quality of the musicians that Ringo puts behind him. It's an incredible show. And,
exactly.
And, and how hard is that going to be to find musicians that want to play with Ringo? Hello.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, I think one of the mainstays is Todd Rundgren, just to give a good example. And there was one of those American music. He came in just in the immediate aftermath of the Beatles. He was a little younger, but his band, the Nas, by probably about 1968 or so, Todd Rundgren had a pretty good solo career in the early 70s. So just to have that guy, and, everybody gets to play a couple of their big hits and the like, it shows the kind of talent that Ringo can bring in.
Well, Peter Frampton was another one.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So which raises the question of the Beatles, of course, and everything that they inspired, what had inspired them, and everything that came along in the aftermath of what they did when they came to this country.
Well, let's talk about the American artists that were most influenced by the Beatles. There's so many of them. We could talk about. This might be a good juncture to bring in Buddy Holly.
Oh, okay. So in terms of the artists that when you teach the class, there's certain pieces of the history of rock and roll you have to teach, and that is some of the founding fathers. And Buddy Holly would be one of those who's inescapable. And that's great because Buddy Holly, the tragedy, as we know, is that Buddy Holly was 22 when he died. What would have become, where would he have gone had he lived a full life, given the musical talent that he had shown already? But the Beatles obviously were listening to Buddy Holly very closely. The Beatles, the first record when they were still called the Quarrymen. They did a recording it would have been 1958. It was one of those where, you've heard other examples where you can go to somebody who has this business and you pay a relatively modest sum and you get to cut two sides and it's on an acetate. And the first thing they recorded was That'll Be the Day. And it sounds kind of rough, but it's John Lennon singing and they're doing a pretty good job. And so clearly they very much admired Buddy Holly and listened to his records very closely. And then when Buddy Holly died, as I said, literally no Buddy Holly, no Beatles, in that the boys were having a conversation. At that point, the bass player was John's friend from art college named Stu Sutcliffe. They were saying, what can we do to honor Buddy? And it was Stu who had the idea. Well, it was Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Why don't we play off of that and we'll become the Beatles with two E's like the bug. And John loved wordplay, and there again is the word right behind you. So he said, yeah, but let's change the second E to an A and emphasize the beat and the beat poets and that kind of thing. And so it was the inspiration for the name. So at any rate, I think the Buddy Holly story is very important in those respects. Obviously, Chuck Berry is a great songwriter. Chuck Berry's songs from the very beginning, from Maybelline would be a good example. Tell a story. Maybelline's the story of a car chase. It's a Ford and a Chevy and trying to catch, and I caught Maybelline at the top of the hill. And what happens next? Well, we don't know. The song ends there. But Chuck tells a song like Promised Land, where he's traveling out to California. And my God, in about just a little over 2 minutes, there's so many words and all the places he's citing and the like. And that inspired the Beatles lyrically. And when they cover a song like a rollover Beethoven. George sang that on, I think, their second album, clear homage to Chuck Berry. Elvis, you have to talk about Elvis. In my mind, Rick, Elvis is the king. Now, again, that's something that could be debated. There could be some pushback, but I will make the case that Elvis is rightly called the king of rock and roll, and they loved Elvis. I like the point you made about minimalism, because Keith Richards made that same point about Heartbreak Hotel, that and others said the same thing. I forget, probably John, the first time they heard it on the radio in 1956, it was like, oh my God, what is that? It just seems so revolutionary. But now we listen to Heartbreak Hotel, and it seems again there's a lot of quiet, there's a lot of stop time in there. I think it's a good example of the notes not being played are very important in setting the whole mood and tone for that song. And the other one I would cite, again, among the giants, would be Little Richard. And you hear that, for example, in Paul's voice, when Paul can sing the ballads and has a very lovely singing voice. Think about a song like Yesterday would be a good example.
Mm-hmm.
But then he'll do one like a Little Richard cover, like Long Tall Sally, and he has that really gruff R&B voice, and also that falsetto woo, where they would do that and they would shake their hair. That's where that comes from. That whoop is straight from Little Richard. And where's Little Richard getting that? It's coming straight out of the black churches in the southern part of the United States. So there's a good way, again, to tie in the social and cultural history of the United States. So you have to talk about all those guys. The problem with a class like this is to not get stuck, because if I weren't careful, I could spend half the semester just on that and barely even get to the Beatles. So you have to move along, and that's very frustrating because all of those artists are so great, and there's so many others who could be thrown in. Bill Haley would be a good example of someone that they also very much admire. The Everly Brothers. Sadly, some of these guys get short shrift, or I don't even have time to even barely mention them. But those would be some of the artists who inspired them, without doubt.
When I was on the road with my last group, I think one of the high points, we were just 2 weeks rehearsed. This is going to be in 74, 73, 74. We had just finished getting, I think we had 1.5, maybe 2 shows put together in 2 weeks' time. This is with another couple of guys that I had never worked with before. They were looking for a singing drummer, and I had just broken up with my other group. And we get booked at the Sahara in Lake Tahoe, and we drive up. I remember so vividly driving up in that moment of getting right in front of that hotel and seeing the billboard, Elvis Presley, and right below that was my band name, Tapestry.
What an honor, though. Yes.
How many people can say they got their names with Elvis Presley? So it was a very cool time, and yes, he was the king. There's no doubt about that. We can tell you a lot of stories, of which we don't have time to do here. That would probably be another episode, and we can go into that. But in the another connection that I had, mentioning, Buddy Holly, Peggy Sue Guerin, God bless her soul. She, when I was producing a show here in El Paso called the Border Legends of El Paso, which I did from 2009 to 2016, we had Peggy Sue come in and sell her book here at the show. And it was so cool. She was such a neat lady. And I remember her saying, what we did is we had my co-producer, Rod Crosby, he loved 3 major acts in his life. He loved Buddy Holly, and he loved Johnny Cash, and he loved Bobby Fuller 4. And he played a lot of Buddy Holly. And so having Peggy Sue come into El Paso, which is something that I had arranged, it was just so special for him, because in his part of the show, he would start off playing usually Buddy Holly, usually something like That'll Be the Day or something. But there's a point in his part of the show where I helped Peggy Sue up to the stage, because she was getting up there in age a little bit. So I'm walking her up to the stage, and we had a sub stage right in front of the stage where I had a chair up there, and I walk her up the steps so she could sit right there in front of Rod and let Rod serenade her. And Rod did Peggy Sue to Peggy Sue.
Yeah,
And it was
yeah.
so cool. At the end of the show that night, she said to me, she says, Rick, out of all of the times that I've been going to see, Buddy and doing all of the, concerts and things that I've done similar to yours, she said, this is without a doubt one of the very best ones that I've ever seen.
Mhm.
That's really something to be said about Rod, because he was a very much a perfectionist in his music and the way he delivered it.
Yes,
So
yes,
that was quite a compliment coming from
yes.
Peggy Sue. She was a neat
And
lady. Yeah.
Buddy Holly did an English tour. It must have been in 1958, and he played in Liverpool. But incredibly, the Beatles weren't there that night. And there's a biographer named Mark Lowenstein, and he says, I don't have an answer. It's not that the tickets were overpriced. There were tickets available. It's not that they did, for whatever reason. And I think we can analyze, maybe just something happened and you just didn't go. But they had seen, John and Paul specifically had seen Buddy on television during that tour, playing, I'm sure, a show out of London. And they watched with such keen interest as they'd been listening to the records and trying to figure out what he was doing. But not until, for instance, whichever song it was, it might have been That'll Be the Day, could they see that he was using a capo on that particular tune. And
Mhm.
okay, that's the key to it right there. So they were just such keen fans of Buddy Holly. And it would be interesting to say, well, they were there that night and they met Buddy Holly, like Bob Dylan saw Buddy Holly on his last tour and said he made eye contact from the front of the stage. But unfortunately, there's not that aspect of the story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I would be remiss if I didn't in this episode to talk a little bit about the rock and roll and the collapse of communism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's something to that. I mean, that point has been made, and I think there's a case to be made. And that's that rock and roll has always had a rebellious aspect. I mean, it had rock and roll was controversial in this country. There were many enemies of rock and roll who didn't like it when it first emerged in the 1950s and would like to have seen this awful music go away. Some of that's coming from the point of view in this country of parental authority because rock and roll was the new generations was the music of youth, and it had some edgy aspects. Most of it come from inspired by rhythm and blues, and so it was raising some uncomfortable questions in some eyes about race relations in this country. As I said again, it's about sex on certain levels, but it has this rebellious aspect, and I think that's the problem with the communists. That countries like the Soviet Union, by the time the Beatles were famous, those countries were run by very old men who were very set and conservative in their ways.
Hmm.
And they didn't like this music, and they understood that this music could have a subversive effect. And so they did all they could to suppress it. But kids in countries behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it at that time, wanted to listen to this music anyway. Part of it's because the ruling authorities were telling them they couldn't do so. And we know that the way you want to inspire kids to do the contrary is to tell them what they can't do. And so there was underground efforts to try to do all they could to bootleg copies and to pass them around to circulate the music. And so I think there was that it contact with the West and the feelings that in the West there certain aspects of life are very much better. God knows, living in a society like East Germany, can you imagine how gray and dull and oppressive that would have been? And I've heard people say that to hear the Beatles, just, what it meant, how transformative it was in their lives. So when Paul writes a song like Back in the USSR, he's poking fun. I mean, it's satirical because he's not saying literally, oh my God, it's really good to be back there because it's so much better in Moscow, right? One of the points Paul is making is they didn't allow people to travel because the problem would be if they allowed them to travel, they would defect. And so he's kind of poking fun at that whole aspect of Soviet society. And that's another good example, too, of bands that are influencing the Beatles and vice versa, because there's a lot of Beach Boys influence in that in terms of the backup vocals, the harmonies, in terms of the references, like California Girls, where Mike Love is singing about the girls name checking the girls in the Midwest and the Southern farmers' daughters, and the Midwest farmers' daughters and the Southern girls and the way they talk. But the California girls are the greatest. Then the Beach Boys, the Beatles, Paul's writing is talking about the Ukraine girls really knocked me out. And George is always on my mind, the Moscow girls and all that. So, and it, Chuck Berry had a song back in the USA. So, but I think there's something to that. The other example I would cite is that's pretty specific. When the communists were overthrown in Czechoslovakia, and after the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, those other countries' communism collapsed pretty quickly. Czechoslovakia, when that happened, they called it the Velvet Revolution. And it so happened that the dissident leader, Václav Havel, the intellectual who became the president of Czechoslovakia after that, was a huge fan of the Velvet Underground. And that was a band that never had a lot of commercial success in this country, but they inspired a lot of people because that kind of avant-garde music, that kind of artsy music with such an edge, inspired him in the dark days when he had to keep his head down, right? And so the very fact that, and later when the Velvet Underground do a reunion tour in the early 1990s, they played in Prague. And there are pictures of Lou Reed with the president of Czechoslovakia, who was so much a fan of their music. So I think there's something to that rock and roll kind of helped erode as contact with the West did generally, kind of helped undermine a society that had a lot of rotten aspects already. And at a certain point, the whole thing just collapsed. Now, did rock and roll do it by itself? No, but I think it's in the mix.
We were watching a movie a couple nights ago with Robin Williams, one that was done quite a few years ago. The movie was Moscow on the Hudson, and Robin Williams speaks Russian through just about all the movie. And then he comes to America, and he does speak English. He learns how to speak English before he comes, but it's still pretty broken when he gets here. But as it develops, he ends up being able to speak English pretty well. He's a saxophone player in the movie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's really all about coming from that suppressed, time of his life over there with only being able to do certain things, very controlled. Mm-hmm. And then coming over here, the KGB and everything's all involved. It's really quite a good movie. And then I think today, when you think about musicians that are so great, that there's a group called Leonid and Friends. I don't know if you've ever heard them. Leonid. In fact, that's one of the characters in this Moscow on the Hudson movie is the guy named Leonid, Leonid. And that's the name of this group, Leonid and Friends. They're a Russian group. When you look at them, you would think they look as American as you and I. And they're some of the most incredible musicians. In fact, Bernie was asking me the other day, he says, are you familiar with Leonid and Friends? And I said, oh yeah, I've been following them for years. They're really, really good. They're only a cover band, but they play and sing these songs almost as good and maybe even better than the original artists. They are that incredible. So I had to bring that into this discussion because I think it deserves to be mentioned that many of those musicians, not so much today, wouldn't remember what it was like back when, but their parents certainly would,
Yes, right,
And
right.
so
Would remember those days indelibly. And I think just the general point is dictators don't like rock and roll because rock and roll on one level is about freedom. Yeah, I heard one person make that point in regard to the Grateful Dead, that, the Grateful Dead's not a band in any way that's explicitly political. And but there's a story about how the Grateful Dead made a connection with the Lithuanian men's basketball team in the early 90s. And right after the Soviet Union had fallen, because the Soviet Union had a great basketball team, but many of those guys were Lithuanians, but now they had their own national team. They hooked up with the Dead, and they were wearing for their warm-ups tie-dye T-shirts and this kind of thing. And somebody was making the point, well, what is it about the Grateful Dead, aside from the fact that one of the Lithuanians was playing in the NBA in the Bay Area, and that's the way the connection was made. And it has to do with that spirit of freedom in Grateful Dead music, that improvisation, that they're so famously a jam band. And so just, I think on a visceral level, it equates to being free. And so it's hard. Dictators, again, don't like that spirit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Let's talk. Let's touch on the psychedelic time of the Beatles. Back in I think that's one of the major parts. About halfway through the life of the Beatles
Mhm.
is their psychedelic influences,
Yeah.
and if you could give some of the examples of some of those psychedelic Beatles songs.
I think some of that starts. There's a famous meeting between the Beatles and Bob Dylan in a hotel room in New York City. I think it occurs in late August of 1964. That Dylan had heard their songs on the radio and was just amazed by songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand. He said their chords are just outrageous. This is really incredibly good. Well, that particular night, Bob Dylan turned them on to marijuana. He was assuming that they smoked already, but as it turned out, they didn't. And they began to delve more further into that drug. And you can see it as soon as the cover photo on Rubber Soul that has a kind of distorted imagery, that it seems to be kind of druggy in that respect. But it becomes more explicit in songs like, well, some of the obvious contenders are Strawberry Fields, that is the music, not so much the lyrics, but the music itself sounds like what one writer has called the derangement of all the senses, just in terms of this music that George Martin's largely responsible for putting with what John had composed. Another obvious example is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Now, John had the cover story, and I think it was actually true, but just coincidence that his son Julian brought home this picture of, he was in preschool or whatever. And John said, "What is that?" And it's my classmate Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And the initials happen to be LSD, just again coincidentally. But there's no doubt that John and Paul are writing the trippiest kind of lyrics imaginable for that song. A lot of stuff that's coming straight out of Lewis Carroll too, which Lewis Carroll and through the Looking Glass in Alice in Wonderland has some really surreal stuff. But the girl with kaleidoscope eyes and all of that's an obvious example too. And in terms of drugs, one example, it may not be the psychedelic stuff, but Dr. Robert, which I think Dr. Robert is on. I think it's on Revolver. I think it is Revolver. Dr. Robert was an example of one of those physicians who played a role in rock and roll history, who always was willing to write the prescriptions,
Mm-hmm.
and he had stuff that would make you feel better. He had a what did he call it? A cup, a special cup is the lyric in the song. It's probably some kind of speech, some kind of injections of maybe amphetamines or vitamins or whatever that would pep you up. And all of that's can be a kind of a slippery slope. And you can really get into terrible trouble. But at the same time, there's some great songs that result from the influence of drugs. And again, they're part of the drug culture that's becoming an important aspect of the social changes of the 1960s.
Tomorrow Never Knows would be another one we could throw in there.
Absolutely. And I think Tomorrow Never Knows is so important. It's the last song on Revolver, and they put it consciously at the very end on the British LP. There were 14 cuts, so it's number 14, and it's like something that comes from another world, because Paul's influenced by avant-garde composers, electronic music composers like Stockhausen, and the use of the tape loops give it some really, really weird sounds. And John is directly inspired by Timothy Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience. And he quotes directly the lines from the book, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. That's from the book. That's the opening words of Tomorrow Never Knows. Then you have George throwing in with the Indian instruments, and the one that makes I think it's called I've forgotten what it's called now, but it makes that droning sound. Then you have this really infectious rhythm track that's Paul on bass and Ringo on drums. And John, one of the lyrics in the song is, "Listen to the color of your dreams." And when I play that song, I'll tell the students, how exactly do you listen to the color of your dreams? Well, John's clearly saying there's maybe something on the sugar cube here is what's going to get you to be able to do that. And I chuckle, and as I was saying, as I told you earlier, Rick, I had to be careful because I don't want to give the impression in class that I'm glorifying drug usage or encouraging. Timothy Leary got in trouble. He was a professor of psychology at Harvard, but he got fired because not only was he advocating the use of hallucinogenics like LSD, he was encouraging his students to experiment with such, and that'll get you sacked, rightly, even if you have tenure. So we have to be careful, but to address it on, yes, it is a major factor in the music, and there were some good results. At the same time, there were the drug casualties that are part of the tragedy of that time. And I'm
Exactly.
not just talking the obvious cases of those who OD'd, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. Those all come within a short span of each other. But some who didn't die, but who were never the same. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was a good example. Someone who had mental issues to begin with, but extensive drug usage exacerbated the problem. And right here in Texas, from Austin, we had Rocky Erickson of the 13th Floor Elevators, who just those guys gobbled LSD. And because they saw it as being an intrinsic part of the music they were making, and Rocky Erickson paid a price and spent a number of years in a mental institution, undergoing electroshock therapy and the like as a result of that.
The other day, you and I were talking a little bit about
Yes, Vanilla Fudge. Yes, yes,
my
and
my
we both were sharing that we had seen Vanilla Fudge in concert,
our
and
very first my very first concert. I think it was yours also, wasn't it?
was mine. I lived for a year in Baton Rouge, and I saw them at their city auditorium, the kind of venue that held, 4,000 or 5,000
Four or
people,
five
something
thousand,
like
yeah.
that. I told you a story that one of the opening groups was the Zombies, which
Yeah.
sounds pretty amazing, but it turned out it wasn't the Zombies. I put it together later because I read that there was a fake Zombies on the road, and I realized that those zombies were not real, that the real zombies had broken up at that time. They later reunited. But I should have known because they played the Zombies' two big hits, She's Not There and Tell Her No. Then they started playing cover songs. They had a guy on lead guitar who was pretty good, and he was the lead. He was singing the songs. And Colin Blunstone, the singer of the Zombies, of course, is just a stand-up vocalist. So that was pretty crazy. But I was making a point that that songs Vanilla Fudge did, and they would do these long versions too, and it was really heavy rock and roll, but they would slow things way down. Songs like "You Keep Me Hanging On," that was by the Supremes. I think they did "Ticket to Ride" on that
Ticket to
album.
Ride also. In
That,
fact,
that,
Ticket to Ride is the number one on the first side of this album, and
and is
Eleanor
She's Not There
Rigby
on
is
there? Yeah,
what's that?
Eleanor. And I think She's Not There on there too.
She's Not There is number three on side one, and then
Yeah,
number six on side two is Eleanor Rigby. So
yeah.
there are three Beatles songs right there that
And
obviously
I have
influenced them.
I'll have to pull that album out when I get home, Rick. But when it was new, I listened to it all the time. That was a favorite band of mine,
Me too.
and
This
yeah,
album's worn out, man.
yeah. And I was making the point that it's not my point originally, but drug usage, sometimes smoking marijuana slows down time, right? And maybe
Definitely.
some of what's going on and what they're doing with the tempo of those songs. I want to tell you too, another record that stands out from around that period that sold a huge number of copies was Iron Butterfly in Agata Davida.
Got it.
Remember listening to that? And I wonder, I need to pose this to you since we have the opportunity. Ken Womack, when he was here, made the point that the drum solo that's so extended, it's practically that song, last one side of the album, has an influence on Ringo's famous solo at the end on Abbey Road. Have you ever heard that, or do you see any connection there?
I may have heard something about that a long time ago. I don't recall the source or where that came from, but there
Mhm.
could be some validity to that. Yeah.
Well, he played samples back to back. It's like, yeah, I think there could be something there. And I think, Ken Womack's a guy who doesn't just, shoot, off the cuff. And but anyway, that brings me back to some of the bands from that time that are probably never going to be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but nonetheless, were important and they had an impact at least. And again, they take us back to that period in which this music is the soundtrack of our lives when we were at a certain point in life.
The Beatles had such an influence in the state of Texas too. You want to talk a little bit about the Sir Douglas Quintet?
Yeah, I've done some research there, and by that I mean I've worked in some papers that their manager Huey Moe has deposited at the University of Texas, and I also interviewed. Doug Sahm had died by the time I did this work some years ago, but I talked to Augie Myers, the famous keyboardist, and I talked to Johnny Perez, who was the drummer. I talked to Jack Barber, who was the original bassist, and
Hmm.
also to Doug's son Sean, who lives out in the hill country. And there's an interesting story there. Huey Moe, who was called the Crazy Cajun, was one of these guys who was He was a great record man. That is, he was one of those guys who had an ear for what can be a hit. And so he produced a number of hit records in the early 1960s. One example was a song by Dale and Grace called I'm Leaving It Up to You. And that went all the way to #1 in late 1963. The genre is called swamp pop, and it's a kind of a distinctive sound that comes out of the Cajun country of South Louisiana. He did Sonny and the Sunglows out of San Antonio. They did a song called Talk to Me. It's a cover of Little Willie John. That was a big hit too. So he did Mexican performers, and he did Cajuns, and he did blacks. He had a number of hits, but then the Beatles came and the British invasion, and Huey Long, said it many times. I was scared out of my mind because the market was drying up for the kind of songs that I had been producing. And he was looking, he didn't want to go out of business. And around the same time that I was able to pinpoint this, the Dave Clark Five played a show in San Antonio in the Freeman Coliseum on the night of December 8, 1964. And as I said, the DC-5 was very big at that time. So the Beatles came, they played Dallas in 1964, but they didn't play Houston or San Antonio. But we got the Dave Clark Five. Houston had them play as well. And that night, as you remember, Rick, in that period, the major bands like the Beatles wouldn't play a long set. They would play maybe half an hour. But given the length of the songs, they could cram in maybe 12 songs pretty easily in that length of time. But that meant there had to be opening bands. Well, that night there was a band called the Goldens that opened, a San Antonio band, and Augie Myers was in that group. And there's a photo of him already with long Beatles type hair. He's playing an organ called the Vox Continental that the Animals played. The DC-5 had it in their very distinctive kind of sound. So he was in that band.
Rick Kern's band had one of those.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
They liked the way the keys, that the black and white, the color of the keys was flipped around.
Right.
And it was, the red, it was red and a very highly portable. And Augie said I think he told me he purchased his for $285, had it shipped from England for a rock bottom price. But anyway, so the Goldens were on the bill that night, and also Doug Somm's band. They were called the Marquis, I believe.
Right.
And he had in his band Johnny Perez and Jack Barber, and they had another guy. Well, anyway, so they saw that night how the Dave Clark Five was extremely popular, and they decided to combine forces. Augie joined Doug's band, and then they hooked up with Huey Moe, who was looking for something, as he said, that would sound Britishy. And we got to come up with the name that sounds Britishy. So what's better than the Sir Douglas Quintet? And maybe try to speak in some fake British accents and make it seem like this is another British invasion band. And if you notice the cover of their first album, the band is in shadows. Now, if you look closely enough, you can see they have long hair, and they're wearing Beatle boots, and they're wearing suits. So it's in the Beatles style, but they're not seen in full light. There's some later photos from that same photo shoot, and we see the reason why they were in the shadows, because 3 of the guys are Mexican Americans. So that would have blown the whole cover, right? I'm sure you would have some equivalent in El Paso of some Mexican kids growing hair and forming a British invasion style band trying to pass themselves off as English. So, so anyway, so they did their song. The first song they did was She's About a Mover. They was the first song they released, and it became a pretty big hit. It, I think, peaked at number 13 in the spring of 1965. If you listen to She's About a Mover, the song that the Beatles had just released before that Dave Clark Five show was She's a Woman. And the rhythm track is exactly the same.
Oh, wow.
So there's a clear influence there. And that became a pretty big hit. So the Sir Doug Quintet's important because I was able to document by going back and just studying the Billboard charts. They were the second American long-haired band in the aftermath of the Beatles to crack the top 20. The first was a group from the Bay Area called the Beau Brummels. They had a hit called, was it Just a Little or Laugh Laugh? I forget which one was the first big hit. It was one of those. I think it was just a little.
Just a little, I think, yeah.
Just a little, a couple of months earlier. And right after the Sir Doug Quintet came the Byrds, and the Byrds went all the way to number 1 with Mr. Tambourine Man in, I want to say, late June of 1965. So the floodgates were opened. It took a little while, but American musicians got the idea, grow some long hair, play some songs in something like, although Sir Doug Quintet was playing, some good Texas-based R&B and Tex-Mex and the like, but cultivates what some could perceive to be the British sound, and that's where things are going. So there's a great Texas connection there. Now, Doug got busted. He and two other guys associated with the band got busted for marijuana in Corpus Christi at the airport in late December of 1965. And in Texas at that time, conviction for marijuana possession could get you 2 years to life in the state penitentiary. They had some good lawyers. They got off, fortunately, with 5 years probation. And as soon as they could clear it that this was okay, it didn't violate the terms of their probation, they split to California. So they become part, that exodus of the people like Janis Joplin from Texas who didn't feel they fit in, that Texas was too conservative an environment, that the Bay Area and the hippie scene was beckoning at that time. So the Sir Doug Quintet become part of that relatively shortly thereafter.
We've talked a lot about the groups that were influenced by the Beatles, but the Beatles also were influenced by Black and Latin musicians.
Yeah.
In the newly released movie, it's a documentary called Stax Soulsville, USA. It just came out a couple of weeks ago on HBO Max channel, and it's quite good. It's a 4-episode documentary, and we binged one night. We watched all 4 of them that night because a good friend of mine, Terry Manning, was all part of that production. Mm-hmm. He worked with Steve Cropper at Stax Studios there in Memphis. But at one point in the documentary, it talks about Steve Cropper and Booker T and the MGs went to the UK. They were doing a tour over there, mm-hmm. and it showed. Well, I think there was some video of it where Paul McCartney, if I'm not mistaken, Paul was sitting in the audience and was really digging the show. He just loved Booker T and the MGs.
What a great band.
Oh yeah, great band. I mean, and to this day, it's like we were talking about earlier. The music, it stands today. It never gets old. I mean, Green Onions. We're always gonna hear that song and go, gosh, I played that in one of my very first bands. Along with the Ventures music and Dale and the Dale Tones and
exactly.
all of these bands that we could sit here literally for hours and talk about their music and how it still stands today. Mm-hmm. The Beatles, speaking about being back in the UK, when the Beatles, they opened for several of the American acts also that went over there before they had broken out and came to the U.S., 2 of which are friends of mine, Tommy Rowe, that did the song Sweet Pea and Dizzy. He's had great hits. And then and the other one is Chris Montez. Mm-hmm. He had Let's Dance, Call Me, The More I See You. And he's one of the guys that still goes to Clear Lake every year to do the Ritchie Valens music. He does La Bamba and a lot of the hits. And it's a big event. So anyway, it's all related. I mean, like we were talking about earlier, we had groups that influenced the Beatles, and we had many groups that the Beatles influenced their music.
Absolutely. They were part of those package shows, those performers you're talking about. There would be, looking back now, how would it have been to have been in one of these theaters again that maybe seated a couple thousand people and to have seen all these great performers right there on the stage? And at a certain point, the Beatles are opening for those guys because the Beatles are just kind of up and coming at that time. I think it was the Stones I was thinking about, Rick, earlier, who at one point they were on a bill like that with the Everly Brothers. And right in the middle of that, the Stones were really beginning to break in the UK. And the Everly Brothers very graciously said, hey, you guys should follow us. Because it was just, as great as the Everlys were beginning to fade a little bit in popularity by 1963, say. But it was just hard for them to follow with their kind of style of those pretty harmonies and the like, to follow the Stones, especially when by then you had all those girls out there screaming for this group. So things are in transition for sure at that time.
I still want to do a show with the Stones, but I haven't been able to work that out yet. A good friend of mine's sister, Patty Hansen, is married to Keith Richards. So there's that connection, but it hasn't come to fruition yet. I'm still waiting on that moment.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Exactly. And I told you that too, that I'll have that. There's that division that exists that if you could play God and there could only be one band, the Beatles or the Stones, which one would you opt for? And it's okay to, we can love both of them, but maybe we can't love both of them with exactly quite the same level of intensity. If you push me, it's the Beatles.
Oh, it's the
But I'll
Beatles.
have but I'll have students who like the Stones, who they're minority, but I'll have those every time I teach the class. And it tends to be the kids who like the harder stuff. It's fairly predictable that those are the kids who are going to be the ones who really love metal, and they love bands Ozzy and Black Sabbath and Metallica. I mean, that kind of style is more appealing. But the one Beatles song, of course, that really grabs them is Helter Skelter,
Oh
which
yeah.
is kind of a proto metal, kind of a precursor of metal, and that's a Paul song because it undercuts that whole stereotype that Paul just wrote the sweet and pretty stuff.
And then we're
Uh,
getting back into the drug thing again with the Manson story and all of that.
oh yes, absolutely. And there's that Beatles connection. As Manson was convinced that there were several songs in the White Album whereby Manson was a nut, but the problem is Manson was a very and you've heard Manson speak. He's gone now, of course, but he was an incredibly charismatic figure, and you could see how he knew he was a lifelong convict. That some of those guys have that skill of understanding vulnerable people and being able to pull them in and recruit them into his family. So he was making the case that the Beatles were sending him messages through the White Album to start a race war, and that ultimately he would end up being seen as the Messiah, as Manson, the Son of Man, kind of a Christ-like figure. And it was really twisted and ugly stuff. But nonetheless, I don't think there's any doubt that this is a thesis of the LADA Vince Bugliosi in Helter Skelter. That's where that reference came from. This was the motive for the Manson killings in the summer of 1969. I
Well,
was talking to somebody about that, and he pointed out the very day that Sharon Tate and Abigail Folger and the first five were killed in that home on Cielo Drive. I think that was August the 8th of 1969. The Beatles in London were doing the famous photo shoot outside of Abbey Road.
wow.
How could you
Wow.
be further worlds apart than the horrible stuff that Manson and the Manson gang were doing? What?
Manson, as uneducated as he was, the guy was super charismatic. You know,
Yes, yes,
I was watching one of his moments where he was talking before the two or three of the board of the prisoner board on
yeah,
trying to get
uh-huh,
paroled, and I
yes,
was watching that just like a week or two ago, and
uh-huh,
the guy, as loony as he was,
hmm,
I could see where he could easily encourage people to join his cause and everything that he did.
absolutely,
With
absolutely. The
it-
story there too is that Manson was convinced he could become a rock and roll star, and one of the well, it's an uneasy thing to do, but I do it in class. Is did this guy have any talent? So Manson had recorded some demos, and one of those that I play in class is a song called "Look at Your Game, Girl," where he's singing. It's a composition of Charlie Manson's, and he's playing and playing. He's singing and playing guitar, and I think almost everybody will say when they listen to it, it's not bad. I've
really
heard a lot worse. Yeah. But for all
interesting.
kinds of reasons, I think Terry Melcher, the producer he was trying to convince to record him, had some negative vibes for good reason and didn't want to do that. And Charlie was very upset about that. And that could be the key to why that house where Terry Melcher used to live was targeted. Terry Melcher didn't live there anymore, but what Manson knew the place. He had been there before. Who had taken him there? Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting story. And once again, I have to stress, you can imagine how much fun it is. This is bloody, awful stuff, but how much fun it is to talk about it in class because it utterly grips the students. I mean, the last thing we want to do is stand up there and I want to have a discussion with students, but I don't want to, whatever I'm doing, I want to bore them to death. But the
Well,
Manson story is not going to do that.
I think that's why what you're doing, Steve, and what I'm doing with my podcast, it's so important. Uh, this is my passion, and I love the stories, and I love keeping the the legacies alive, keeping the memories alive, for future generations. I mean, you're teaching students that, well, I'm sure a lot of them they're familiar with the music and everything, but they don't know the backstories. And to take a course like you're teaching and everything and learn all of this. It's so intriguing, so interesting, and I think it's so vitally important, which to me, it begs the question, why is our world much better by having the music of the Beatles and other great bands of the 60s?
Well, I think about that a lot, about the role of contingency in history. And it's like, well, what if John and Paul, these two teenagers, one of whom was 15 and one 14 at the time, what if they hadn't met on that day in July of 1957? Liverpool, after all, was a pretty big city, and it wasn't guaranteed that their paths were going to cross. And had that friendship never been established, then we wouldn't have had the Beatles. It's like the butterfly effect. If you go back in history and change something, even maybe a little bit, then everything that follows has been altered. And so I think about that, about what the world would have lost. So if we think back about the Beatles, what did they sing about? Well, primarily they sang about love. And I mean, some of the songs like Revolution or Political are cited back in the USSR, but that's not typical. It was mainly about relationships. And what is more important than that, especially in this world we live in today? And I think about John, when they did the satellite broadcast in June of 1967, he needed to write a song that the whole world could appreciate, and it was All You Need Is Love. And so, it's on such a basic but important level. And I used to wonder about that, where the line is, all you need is love, love is all you need. And John liked wordplay, and he liked please, please me. He liked to double the words up. But I kind of got it differently when I was in Liverpool with my wife a couple of years ago, because the expression the locals use, you go into a bar, coffee shop, say, and the barista will say, well, what can I get for you, love? And so I think on one level, what John is saying is, all you need is love. Love is all you need. And, I think that's such an important legacy, that it was beneficial to the world. And it's a message that still is good today. For men of our generation, for men and women of our generation, it's the music that was our coming of age music. It just so happens that it was the music of the 60s, and for various reasons, other periods produced great music too, but the music of the 60s was especially good and especially enduring. And I just have to say, on a personal level too, this music always picks me up. We always have those days. We get the blues, right? That's why we can relate to the blues. It's human sometimes to just, feel down or depressed. Hopefully not, in a clinical sense where you can't get up and function, but the music always lifts me up. I think about one of the early songs, "Thank You, Girl," that the lines go something like, "You've been good to me. You made me glad when I was blue. And eternally, I'll always be in love with you. And all I've got to say is thank you, girl." Right? So it's a kind of a homage to the girls who screamed and who loved the band, who were their base, so to speak. But you made me glad when I was blue. And that's very important, that we have this music to lift us up, because we all need it from time to time. And I'd say in this world we live in, Rick, we got to love each other. We're facing some difficult times, and love each other in the sense of, I have to care about you and you need to care about what happens, whether good things or bad things happen. And so the music, I think, can keep our mind in a good place in that respect. So I'm really glad it happened. Again, that's the thesis of the movie Yesterday, which the idea behind the movie is the Beatles, they didn't exist. But there was one guy who, for peculiar reasons, he knew about the songs, and in the end, he doesn't get in trouble, because there are a couple of other people who also remember the songs, and they said, we're just glad that somebody out there is going to keep the memory alive. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened, and the world would have been a much lesser place. So that's, I think, my take on the music of the 1960s, and I imagine that you very much feel the same way.
Totally. If we hadn't had, I don't know, I say this all the time, the music of the 60s, it was the best. It really was. It didn't,
Well,
it's not taking anything away from the 70s. It was great also, because I played it. We were on the road playing it.
Yeah.
And there was so many great groups out then, but I think the evolution of the Beatles in the 7 years, 7 months, and a few days of having them in our music patrimony. It doesn't get any better than that. You know, their
Yes.
music will last forever. The last album that they did, Let It Be, that's all I can say, man, about this whole thing is let it be.
Yeah. And I wanted to say about that obviously that's a song that comes at the end of their history. And what a perfect finale it is, because it's about Paul remembering that when I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Mother Mary could mean Mary, as in the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God. There's Catholic influence in Paul's family and Irish heritage there. But he's talking about his mother, who died of breast cancer when Paul was in his early teens. And the whole idea that somebody comes to you and speaks words of wisdom, and those are such words of wisdom, because in our lives we always have situations where maybe somebody hurts your feelings or something happens that kind of, ruins your day, but you want to maybe retaliate, but then you have to think sometimes, let it be, just let it go. Within a day or two, I'm not going to even think about this anymore. And that really is such a wise thought. And I think, again, there Paul is talking about the Beatles coming to an end, and he's done all he could to keep the band together, but in the end, you just got to let it be and just keep on keeping on.
The subliminal message there, just it's the way it is, let it be, and let's move on, and it's exactly what they're doing, but
it's just beautiful. But I agree with you. It's such a shame. There's so many bands that were great. I wish I could have time to talk about the Association and the Turtles, even the Monkees. As much as we derided them in the 60s because it was studio musicians, well, a lot of bands use studio musicians. And I have to say, when I listen to some of the Monkee songs, some of that stuff is really, really good.
Okay, and Steve, here it is, man. Here it is.
Yeah.
My last show was with Jim Messina, and we decided that we have so much to talk about that we're going to do a part 2. And so guess what? You and I are going to do a part 2, and we're going to talk about the Association and the Turtles and the Monkees and all that, because I've done shows with some of those guys already anyway, and so we can, who knows, maybe we can even bring in 1 or 2 of them to be a part of our show.
That would be great. And I'd really love to do that. I think that would be something, because again, the fact that I don't get time to do it in class, well, doing it in this context with you, I'll guarantee you that I'll take the recording later and I'll give my students access to it.
Good.
And the magic words, Rick, are extra credit, right? I mean, that always, especially toward the end of the semester. But I think if they listen to a show like this that I'm doing with you, they're gonna learn something. And I'm talking about the students who aren't in my Beatles class, but there's gonna be some content that they will benefit from.
Well, I will tell you, Jules Alexander from the Association he would love to do it with us, and he's a great storyteller and a really, really nice guy, and we'll definitely talk more about doing that.
That'd be great.
This has been a real treat, and I once again want to thank my friend Bernie Sargent for bringing the introduction to you, because without that we wouldn't be having this meeting today. But I really appreciate your time, Steve, and I've learned something today. This would have been a course that I would have really enjoyed having back in my 1969 freshman year at UTEP. Oh
yeah, I get those students who are really fired up, and it's right in their wheelhouse, and it's always so exciting. And then I have some who, they're kind of into it, but they'll get more interested. So yeah, you would be the ideal student in this kind of class.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate you doing the show with me, my friend, and we'll definitely do another one a little bit down the road. Okay.
Okay, that sounds good. I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you, buddy. Enjoy the rest of your week, okay?
Okay, sounds good. All right.
See you. Bye-bye.